Hey friends, tonight we're not stepping into the court of a king or watching a knight ride into battle. No grand feasts, no heralds shouting names. Instead, we'll walk a quieter path through overgrown gardens behind crooked cottages, into smoky rooms filled with the scent of herbs, and along dusty village roads where someone waits with hope in their heart and fever in their chest. We're talking about medieval medicine, a time when science and superstition walked hand in hand, and healing was as much about courage as it was about knowledge. Not all of it worked, of course, but in the midst of it all, there were people, wise women, monks, herbalists who tried, who listened, who mixed and mended, and did their best with what the world had given them. So if this kind of soft, strange history soothes you, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights. Let the sound of the fire and the weight of a warm blanket wrap around you, and let's begin our journey. In a valley tucked far away from the noise of cities, where hills curved gently like sleeping animals and rivers ran slow and brown, there lived a woman named Alice. Alice was not a physician. She had no scrolls, no seal, and no patron. But for miles around, people called her the healer. Her cottage sat at the edge of the woods, where the trees whispered in the wind and rabbits left tiny footprints in the dirt. Around the house grew wild things, not just weeds, but medicine, comfrey, yarrow, wormwood, lavender, nettles. More than any scholar, Alice knew their names, not just the Latin ones, but the names whispered by grandmothers and passed down like lullabies. She woke before the birds. Her hands were always busy grinding, drying, boiling, mixing. She kept a mortar carved from stone, worn smooth by years of use, and shelves lined with bottles, jars, and bundles of herbs tied with string. Most of her patients were farmers, sometimes a shepherd with a festering wound, a child with coughs that shook their ribs, a mother afraid for her baby. Alice would listen quietly, ask no foolish questions, and then choose a poultice, a tea, a charm, a bath in rosemary water. They said she never turned anyone away, even when all she had left was bread crusts and nettle broth. And every evening, after the work was done, she sat beside the fire, sipping something bitter from a clay cup, and murmured to herself, "May the old ways remember us." Not far from Alice's cottage, across the fields and down the old Roman road, stood a monastery, and within that monastery lived Brother Ferris, keeper of the infirmary. Ferris had studied the humors. He knew the balance of black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. He had seen charts drawn by hands long dead, and believed firmly that most illness came from imbalance. His treatments were precise. If a man burned with fever, he must be bled. If he grew cold and pale, he must be warmed and fed sweet wine. The infirmary was quiet, lined with wooden beds and soft candlelight. Ferris prayed over his patients, anointed them with holy oil, and carefully opened their veins with a brass lancet when the time came. He did not scorn Alice, nor did he speak her name, but sometimes, in the market, he would glance at the herbs in her basket and nod ever so slightly. Alice, in turn, once left a bundle of marigold and sage on the monastery doorstep. There was peace in that silence. And so the valley had two kinds of healers, one who served through books and God, the other through earth and memory. But both, in their own way, were guardians against the dark. In the height of summer, when the heat hung low and heavy over the valley, a sickness came. It started with a cough, then chills, then dark swellings under the arms or behind the knees. No one had seen its like before. At first, they whispered that it was punishment, that perhaps the Lord was angry, or the fields had been cursed. Alice was the first to say it aloud. It is plague. She had seen it once, many years ago, when she was a girl. A traveler had come through her old village, sick and shivering. 3 days later, half the town was gone. Now it had come again. The village shuttered its doors. Ferris barred the gates of the monastery, and Alice gathered herbs like a storm was coming. Smoke became the shield. Fires were lit in every home. Rosemary, sage, and juniper were burned in iron bowls. They believed the smoke would keep the poison in the air at bay. Alice mixed vinegar with rose petals and mint and told mothers to soak cloth in it, tie it over their children's faces. Ferris, in his quiet way, offered prayers hourly. He walked the infirmary with holy water, sprinkling the air, the beds, the bodies. But still, the sickness came. And then, strangely, it left, as quickly as it had come. No one could explain it. No one dared to. But they remembered who had stayed. And they remembered who had listened, who had held their hands when no one else would. Long after the fever faded and the earth was turned for too many graves, the village slowly began to breathe again. But healing did not end with the sickness. There were always more ailments: an aching joint, a wound that would not close, a night of bad dreams. And so the work of Alice and Ferris continued, though not always in ways one might expect. Ferris, ever the scholar, had a shelf of peculiar tools: brass scales for measuring powders, wax tablets for notes, and a velvet-lined box filled with fat, sleepy leeches. He swore by them, said they drew out the bad blood. Some patients believed him. Others fainted at the sight. Alice, by contrast, trusted whispers and wind. If a child woke screaming with no cause, she might hang iron scissors above the cradle or sprinkle salt at the doorstep. If a man dreamt of fire and couldn't sleep, she'd boil valerian and speak soft words no one quite understood. Between them, the two healers offered science and story, steel and spell. And in this odd harmony, people found comfort, found peace. Because sometimes healing wasn't just about the body. Sometimes it was about the soul. In the cold months, when frost crept along the window panes and the hearth never truly went out, a traveler came. He was young, wrapped in wool, with the eyes of someone who had seen too much. A wound glistened along his side, stitched poorly, already red. They took him to Ferris, who frowned, cleaned the wound, and said the prayer for pain. But it was Alice who stayed that night. She boiled wine with cloves and thyme. She sat beside him, whispering old stories of the hawthorn tree, of the fox who tricked death. She pressed a cool cloth to his brow and sang a lullaby with no words. He did not die. When he could walk again, he left with a nod. No name, no thanks, just a quiet smile that Alice carried in her chest for days. Ferris never spoke of it, but that winter, he added time to the infirmary's shelves. Years passed. Ferris grew slower. Alice's hair turned white. Children who had once sat in her lap now brought her their own little ones. And the monastery, though weathered, still rang with morning bells. One day, smoke rose from the woods. A fire, quick and cruel, swept through part of the forest. Alice's garden was spared, but barely. In the soot and ruin, green shoots emerged, tiny and trembling. The old herbs, it seemed, would not give up so easily. Neither did the healers. When Ferris could no longer walk the length of the infirmary, a novice named Tom took his place. He was quiet and kind, and he asked Alice questions no one had asked her in years. They sat by the fire often, the three of them, Alice, Ferris, and Tom, talking not just of cures, but of kindness, of what it meant to tend, to care, to witness. And when Alice passed, it was not in fear. She left her garden to Tom, and Ferris, old and tired, smiled at the boy. "She remembered us," he said. No statues were ever built for Alice, no songs for Ferris. But somewhere, in a valley far from any map, time still grows wild. And in the hush of dusk, when the air smells like rosemary and firewood, the wind carries a memory of a woman who healed with herbs, of a monk who healed with faith, of the quiet science that saved more than we'll ever know. Tom was not Alice, and he never tried to be. He was younger, less sure, but endlessly curious. After Alice's passing, he spent his days restoring her garden, cataloging her herbs, and adding notes to her old parchment scraps. He labeled each plant in both Latin and the names Alice had spoken aloud, the ones passed down from forgotten mothers. In time, villagers began to come to him, hesitant at first, but soon with baskets of eggs, questions, ailments. He never promised to cure, only to care. Tom kept a small journal. On the first page he wrote, "Sometimes healing is listening." The monastery, too, changed. Under Ferris's quiet influence, the infirmary began accepting more than monks. Travelers were welcomed, the poor, the lost. Tom often walked between the monastery and the village, now a bridge of sorts. And so, a new chapter began. Rooted in earth, lit by candlelight, held together by memory. The winters grew softer, or perhaps Tom had simply grown stronger. Years had passed since Alice's garden became his. He had tended it with quiet care, never pulling too much, never taking what wasn't ready. The soil still smelled of her touch, earthy and clean, tinged with lavender and iron. At the monastery, the infirmary had changed too. Gone were the old brass tools, kept now in a box more for memory than use. Tom still prayed, as Ferris had taught him, but he also read strange new texts, ones brought from distant towns, bound in leather, filled with ideas Ferris would have called risky. He didn't forget. He blended. He still laid hands with care, still lit candles for those who had passed. But he also boiled water, not for tea, but to clean wounds. He wrote down which herbs worked best for fever and which ones soothed pain without sleep. He began to ask why and sometimes what if. Some villagers whispered that it was not the old way. Others came with hope in their eyes. One day, a merchant brought him a scroll, a translation from the Arabs, full of anatomy and new thoughts on infection. Tom studied it by candlelight, night after night, tracing the diagrams with his fingers. But still, every spring, he knelt in Alice's garden and spoke aloud. "What would you have done?" He liked to think she answered in the rustling of the time. Spring came early that year. The valley shimmered in pale greens and soft golds. Snowmelt fed the rivers, and the wild herbs burst through the soil as if they had only been sleeping, not buried. Tom was older now. The lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened, not with worry, but with watching. He had become, in his quiet way, what both Alice and Ferris had been to him. A steady flame in the corner of a dark room, a warm hand at someone's worst moment. And just as the garden had once called to him, so now it called to another. Her name was Lynn. She was only 10 winters old, daughter of the potter, small and curious, with dirt always under her nails and questions spilling out of her like water from a cracked jar. At first, Tom only noticed her footprints, tiny and light, around the edge of the garden path. Then he began to find bundles of wildflowers placed gently on the step, a sprig of mint tucked into his satchel, a drawing, done in charcoal, of a daisy with its parts carefully labeled in clumsy letters. One morning, she appeared at the garden gate, barefoot and patient. Tom looked up from his work and simply said, "Well then, best come in." From that day, Lynn became his shadow. She asked why nettles stung and why the sage was always planted near the stones. She wanted to know why time seemed to grow even in the cracks, and whether it had a secret name only bees knew. She reminded him of Alice not in face, not in voice, but in spirit. That unshakable gentleness, that hunger for knowing, not to boast, but to heal. He taught her to listen with her hands, to test heat with the back of her fingers, to pick only what was needed, and always say thank you even if it was just to the wind. Sometimes they sat beneath the elder tree, where Alice once brewed her bitter teas, and Lynn would hum as she sorted dried marigold petals. Tom would watch and smile and feel the quiet circle tightening, not closing, but continuing. One evening, as the sun slid behind the hills and the sky blushed with sleep, Lynn turned to him and asked, "Do you think she knows I'm here?" Tom didn't need to ask who she was. He looked out over the garden, the rows neat but not too neat, the scents of rosemary and earth rising with the cool air. "I think," he said softly, "she never really left. Autumn in the valley was never loud." The leaves turned in quiet rustlings, gold and russet drifting gently onto the path. The river slowed, as if thinking, and the sky, tinged with soft gray, seemed to carry the breath of stories long past. Lynn was now near grown, still slim, still full of questions, though now they lived more behind her eyes than on her tongue. Her hands had become deft, careful. She could braid willow bark for tea without looking, and could tell the difference between feverfew and tansy, with her eyes half closed. The villagers had started to come to her quietly, respectfully, first with scraped knees and splinters, then with night fevers, then with things harder to name, dreams that wouldn't go, griefs that clung like damp cloaks, a strange loneliness in the chest. She never promised cures, but she always listened. Tom, now gray at the temples and slower in step, watched her without envy. In the evenings, he sat by the window with a wool blanket across his knees, mending old notes, sketching herbs in the margins of Alice's worn ledger. It was Lynn who tended the garden now. Lynn who mixed the tinctures, Lynn who spoke softly over the sleeping. But sometimes, just before sleep, she would sit by Tom's chair and say, "Tell me again about the marigolds and the monks." And he would laugh, soft and warm, and begin. The seasons moved. There came a year when the rains were too much, and the river ran greedy. The lower fields flooded. Coughs turned harsh. A child went missing, then was found shivering and weak in the reeds by the bend. Lynn stayed through it all. She did not panic, did not raise her voice. She handed out peppermint oil for the breath, dried rose hips for the weak. She lit bay leaves in clay bowls and told the children the smoke would chase the shadows away. And one by one, the villagers believed. One night, when the storm rattled the shutters and the wind screamed like a thing alive, a mother knocked on the door, soaked through, holding a baby who would not stop crying. Lynn took them in without a word. By morning, the baby slept peacefully in a warm bundle beside the hearth, and the mother wept into Lynn's shoulder, not from sorrow, but relief. Outside, the wind had stilled. It was then Lynn stepped into the garden and whispered to the breeze, If you're still listening, I'm doing my best." And the wind, for a brief second, curled around her like a hand. The ledger had yellowed with time. Its spine cracked gently whenever Lynn opened it, and the ink inside had begun to fade not into nothing, but into softness. Like old stories told by candlelight, she kept it on the small table by the window, where the sun came in just right in the morning. The table once belonged to Alice, the chair to Tom, and the pages, well, the pages now belonged to Lynn. At first, she had written carefully, like copying from something sacred. She repeated Alice's recipes word for word, drew her herbs, just as Tom had taught her with neat little arrows and Latin names. But slowly, something shifted. One day, she added a note beneath the entry for elderberry syrup, best given warm with honey, and only after a story has been told. Later, under the drawing of a wound poultice, she scribbled, "This one works better if you sing softly while you stir." Something kind. And still later, beneath a list of plants that ward off fever dreams, she simply wrote, "For when the fear is worse than the fever." She no longer saw the book as just medicine. It was memory. It was rhythm. It was a map not only for the body, but for the soul. Sometimes she would leave pages blank, waiting for new knowledge to grow like moss in the corners. And on rainy afternoons, when Tom napped with a blanket across his knees and the hearth crackled low, Lynn would speak aloud the words she wrote not to anyone, but perhaps to Alice, or to the wind, or to herself. One afternoon, she found an old page near the back one Alice had never filled. The parchment was thin, like the wing of a moth. At the top, in faded ink, was a single line, "For the healer who comes next." Lynn smiled. She dipped her pen in ink, looked out the window at the garden glowing with new thyme and tall foxglove, and began to write, "Begin with listening. Then offer warmth. Use rosemary for the ache, lavender for the restlessness, and marigold for the grief. But remember, your hands are only part of the work. The rest is kindness. The rest is patience. The rest is being there, even when you don't know what else to do." She paused, added, "And it's okay to cry too." When she was done, she closed the book gently, like placing a sleeping child down to bed. Outside, the wind moved through the thyme and whispered something only the plants could hear. The winter came quiet that year. Snow fell not in storms, but in silences, soft drifts that blanketed the hills and softened every edge. The forest stood still, and the sky seemed to hold its breath. In the garden, only the hardiest herbs remained. Rosemary clung to life beneath straw. The thyme had gone silver at the edges. And in the middle of it all stood a lantern, its glass fogged from many years of use, its wick now unlit. Lynn found herself drawn to it one evening. Tom had taken ill with nothing serious, a chill caught during a wet walk from the monastery. He slept soundly by the fire, a cat curled on his chest, and a cup of cooled broth untouched beside him. So Lynn stepped outside. The lantern was cold in her hand. Its metal had rusted a little, but it held its shape, just as Ferris once had, just as Alice had, just as all those quiet healers had before her. She carried it into the cottage and placed it on the hearth. Then she struck a match. The flame flickered, hesitated, then bloomed. And in that moment, Lynn felt it not a voice, not a vision, just the simple knowing that she was not the first, and she would not be the last. There would be more winters, more fevers, more frightened mothers, and old men with shaking hands. There would be more tears, more trying, more failures, and more healing. And someone would come after her. They too would hold this lantern. They would open the book she had written in, sleep in her bed, brew the same bitter teas. They would ask the same questions, and the answers would still be the same. Listen, stay, be gentle, and remember. Lynn sat beside the fire, the lantern glowing low beside her. Outside, the snow continued to fall, slow and steady, like a lullaby written in white. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to rest, just for a little while. In the hush of that moment, the world was still, and the last light, gentle, golden, kept watch. And so, our journey ends not with a trumpet call, not with a battle won, but with the soft glow of a lantern kept alive through many winters. Tonight, we walk the quiet paths of healing in a world long gone where science wore the clothes of faith, where hands worked with herbs, and where hearts held on to hope even when there was little else. We met Alice, who listened more than she spoke, Ferris, who served with steady hands and older prayers, Tom, who learned by doing, and Lynn, who carried the lantern forward. They were not heroes in the way stories often tell, but they mattered. Because healing, true healing, doesn't always look like a miracle. Sometimes it's a warm cup, a steady hand, a whispered word that makes someone feel less alone. And maybe that's what stays with us, long after the fire burns low. So now, as the night wraps gently around you, and your own breath slows, let yourself drift. Let the echoes of rosemary and candlelight linger. You are safe. You are remembered. And somewhere, in a story told softly under stars, a lantern still glows. Good night, my friend. Sleep well.
A soft morning in Eldergrove. In the sleepy village of Eldergrove, where the mist lingers like a memory and the trees lean in to whisper secrets to the wind, an old rooster sang the morning into being. His crow was not harsh or hurried, but rather slow and thoughtful, like a bell tolling not for alarm, but for awakening. It was Thomas who heard it first. Thomas, a peasant of 63 winters, lay quietly on his straw mattress, one hand folded over his chest, the other resting on the carved edge of his wooden bed. He did not rise immediately. For Thomas, mornings were a ceremony, not a task. He listened. Beyond the rooster's voice, he could hear the rustle of the elm leaves outside his cottage, the trickle of the nearby brook, and the faint creak of the rafters overhead. These were the sounds that welcomed him each day, and he treasured them like a monk might treasure a prayer. The light through the window was still pale and blue, morning's first breath. He sat up slowly, bones aching but spirit light. He dipped his feet into the worn slippers by his bed and rose without complaint. Thomas's home was simple. A single room with walls of wattle and daub, a hearth of stone, and shelves lined with wooden bowls, dried herbs, and a few cherished books. He could read, which made him somewhat unusual in the village. Not a scholar, but a quiet collector of wisdom. As he lit the morning fire, he whispered the same words he had whispered for 27 years. Thank you for the warmth and the waking. No one was listening, but perhaps the house was, or the morning. He took bread from the larder, still soft from yesterday's bake, and spread honey, his own, from the hive behind the cottage. He ate slowly by the window, watching the mist rise from the fields like steam from a cauldron, the world slowly stirring to life. A small bird landed on the windowsill, just a robin, bold and curious. Morning to you, little one, Thomas said gently. The robin cocked its head, blinked, and flew away. He smiled. There was something sacred in mornings like this. Not because of what they brought, but because of how gently they arrived. They asked for nothing, yet gave so much. Today, like most days, would be ordinary. He would tend to the garden, mend a fence near the churchyard, check on Widow Elspeth's goat. But Thomas had long ago learned that within the ordinary, the extraordinary waited patiently, like dew on the grass, visible only to those who paused long enough to notice it. He stood and stretched, joints clicking like old door hinges. Then he reached for the lantern by the door. Though it was morning, he carried it still, not to light his way, but as a symbol of something he never quite explained, not even to himself. Perhaps it reminded him of his late wife, or perhaps it reminded him to be a light in his quiet way to those who still walked in darkness. Outside, the village stirred slowly. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the distant laughter of children hinted at another day, quietly blooming in Elder Grove. And so Thomas began his walk, lantern in hand, soul at peace, and the soft rooster's song still echoing in the corners of the morning, a quiet offering to the day. The village of Elder Grove, though modest in size, was rich in its rhythms. The sun, now climbing gently above the oaks, cast golden fingers across the stone walls and thatched roofs. It touched the fields with warmth and lit up the morning dew like flecks of crystal. Thomas had no need for clocks or bells to mark the time. He knew the hour by the way the light leaned through the branches, by the song of the blackbird that came after the robin, and by the gentle creak of old Margaret's shutters swinging open down the lane. As he walked the narrow path between cottages, his lantern swinging slowly from his hand, he was greeted not with words, but with glances and nods. The villagers didn't speak much in the morning. There was a kind of unspoken respect for the early hush, as though the world were still stretching and should not be disturbed. Thomas arrived at the village oven just as the first loaves were pulled from the heat. The baker, young Oliver, had already smudged flour across his forehead and wore the gentle pride of a craftsman in rhythm with fire. "Good morning, Thomas," he said, voice low like the morning itself. "A beautiful bake," Thomas replied, eyeing the soft crusts and the way steam still lifted from the edges. "You've caught the sun in that loaf." Oliver chuckled. Sun and sweat, perhaps. But I'll take it. Thomas picked up his loaf, round, heavy with warmth, and tucked it carefully into the fold of his woolen cloak. Bread was more than food here. It was a symbol of time, of care, of patience rewarded. Every loaf told the story of seeds sown in the spring, harvested under a heavy sky, ground between millstones older than memory, and finally offered back to the people, one crust at a time. Back home, Thomas unwrapped the loaf with the same reverence others might reserve for a letter from a loved one. He sliced it gently, still warm, and set 2 pieces on the wooden board. From the shelf, he took the small clay pot of honey, the same one that had belonged to his wife. He paused. Though she had been gone for 7 winters now, Thomas still spoke to her. Not aloud, not often, but when the honey jar was opened, something inside him stirred. "Still the sweetest thing in the house," he whispered. He spread the honey slowly, watching it glisten in the soft morning light. The scent rose up, floral, golden, comforting. Then he stepped outside. Behind the cottage, a simple bench overlooked the meadow and the stream. It was here he often ate, not for the view, but for the company of sounds. Today, the bees had already begun their rounds, and the soft hum of their wings joined the murmur of water and the sigh of the grass. He sat, took a bite, chewed slowly, and then, as always, he offered the second slice to the earth. He didn't bury it or toss it. He simply laid it on a flat stone by the bench, where birds, mice, or whoever passed might find it. It was something his wife had begun when they were young, just after the war. She had said, "The world feeds us. We should feed it back." And so they had. Now it was Thomas's ritual alone. He looked up at the sky, pale and wide like an unwritten page. A swallow darted overhead, and somewhere behind him a dog barked once, then fell silent again. The breeze carried the smell of bread, the memory of laughter, and the echo of simpler times. And in that moment, Thomas felt full, not just in stomach but in soul. He sat there for a long while, listening, not for words, but for something softer. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask questions, doesn't offer answers, just holds you like warm bread in a gentle hand, a gathering of hearts in the square. The village bell rang not for urgency nor for ceremony, but simply to remind the day that it had begun. It hung from the small wooden tower at the heart of Elder Grove, just above the meeting square. Made of old bronze and etched with ivy motifs by hands long gone, it carried a tone soft and round, like warm iron tapping against memory. Thomas heard the bell from the meadow where he had just finished brushing a bit of flour from his cloak. The chime drifted through the trees and fields, never loud, never rushed, just enough to gently draw people from their hearths and gardens, like bees called to the hive. He stood slowly, stretching his back with a quiet groan, and began the familiar walk into the village. The square was already beginning to gather its morning crowd. Not bustling, not noisy, just gently alive. Children danced around the well, chasing each other with ribbons and sticks. Old men leaned against the stone wall, talking of weather and crops in slow, gravelly voices. The baker's wife set out a basket of sugared rolls. A potter displayed his latest bowls, still pale from the fire. Thomas passed them all with a nod, offering smiles like seeds tossed to fertile soil. He paused near the bell tower where a young boy stood with one hand on the rope. The boy was small, no more than 8, with hair like late summer hay and eyes that seemed too old for his face. "You rang the bell today?" Thomas asked softly. The boy nodded, serious. "Father said it was my turn. He watches from the roof." Thomas looked up and saw the boy's father, Gregor, the carpenter, repairing a loose shingle, hammer in hand, waving with a grin. "A good chime," Thomas said, turning back to the boy. "Not too fast, not too slow, like a story beginning." The boy looked down at the rope, then up again. "Is the bell magic?" Thomas tilted his head. "What do you think?" "I think it wakes the village, and maybe the birds, maybe even the sky." Thomas smiled. "Then yes, it's magic." He moved on slowly, past the baker's stall. Young Oliver had set out a few small tarts, apple, currant, and one he called forest spice, which Thomas suspected was just whatever herbs he had left from yesterday. "First bell tart is free," Oliver said, nodding toward the carpenter's boy. "Bell ringers rule." Thomas picked one up and bit into it carefully. The crust flaked like soft bark, and the filling tasted faintly of cloves and something floral. Maybe lavender. "Not bad," Thomas said thoughtfully. "Tastes like Sunday." Oliver laughed, pleased. At the fountain near the square's edge sat a woman in gray wool, spinning yarn from a bundle of flax. Her hands moved with the slow rhythm of someone who had done this since girlhood. Thomas sat beside her on the bench. No greeting was needed. He had known Miriam for nearly 40 years. They watched the square together in silence for a time. Finally, she said, "You carry your lantern still?" He looked down. "Every day." She nodded. "I always liked that about you. Some men carry swords. You carry light." He didn't reply, just turned the lantern slightly in his hand, watching how the morning sun caught the glass. A silence settled between them again, warm and unhurried. Then Miriam added, almost to herself, "The bell sounds different in spring." Thomas smiled. "Everything does." After a while, Thomas stood and made his way to the well. He filled a small jug with cool water and drank it slowly, watching the reflections ripple across the surface. Sky, clouds, the flutter of wings. Around him, the square pulsed softly with life. A child's laughter, a cartwheel creaking, the bark of a sleepy dog chasing shadows. The village, as always, was its own quiet symphony. He lingered a moment longer, then turned toward the path that led toward the edge of the village, where the old willow trees grew and the river whispered its secrets. As he left the square, the bell rope swayed gently in the breeze behind him, no longer ringing, but still full of sound, like a story paused between pages, threads of memory and quiet truths. The path from the village square wound gently past the chapel, where ivy curled up its stone walls like green lace, and then followed the bend of the road until it reached a humble cottage with faded blue shutters. The weaver lived there. Her name was Adelaine, and though her hands had thinned with age and her back curved like a question mark, her eyes still burned with the sharp clarity of a woman who had never stopped observing the world. Thomas knocked softly. 3 taps, always the same. A courtesy, not a question. He had been coming here for decades. "Doors open," came her voice from inside, dust dry but steady. He stepped into a room filled with the smell of wool, old cedar, and lavender. Sunlight filtered through a curtain of yarn hanging from the rafters, painting the air in soft reds, golds, and blues. Adelaine sat behind her loom, the shuttle moving back and forth with practiced grace. She did not look up. "You're late," she said, but there was a smile in her tone. I stopped to listen to the bell, Thomas replied, hanging his lantern by the door, and to a child with ancient eyes. Children always carry echoes of old souls, she said. We forget that until one stares at us like they know the ending of a story we haven't read yet. Thomas chuckled. He asked if the bell was magic. Adelaine paused, tying a knot. It is, but only to those still young enough to ask. Thomas sat on the bench by the window. He liked this spot best, where he could watch the loom work but also see the field beyond, where poppies danced gently in the breeze. Still weaving the same patterns? He asked. Same patterns, she replied, but different threads. That's the trick of life, Thomas. You think you're doing the same thing over and over, but you're not. Every thread's been touched by time, memory, loss, or love. He nodded slowly. That's what I came to ask you about. She looked over. Love? Number cloth. He smiled. The church altar's runner is worn. I thought perhaps... She interrupted with a small wave of her hand. I'll make a new one. For the spring feast. I've already started. Thomas tilted his head. How did you know? She shrugged. I'm a weaver. I follow the pattern of things, before others even see it. They fell into silence. The only sound was the steady click-clack of the loom like a heartbeat, patient and unhurried. Thomas watched her hands, weathered and sure, as they worked through the warp and weft. Every movement held a memory. Do you ever wonder, he asked softly, how many lives have passed through your threads? Adelaine stopped, her fingers hovering above the wool. She didn't speak right away. Then she said, I used to count. Not names, but moments. A shawl for a mother who lost her child. A scarf for a boy leaving for war. A blanket for a widow's first winter alone. I wove them all, and I felt every stitch. Her voice was softer now. But I stopped counting, because grief isn't a number, nor is joy. It's something you weave into the cloth and hope it holds, quietly, for whoever needs it next. Thomas stared at the loom. That's more than I expected. Adelaine laughed gently. That's weaving. It always gives you more than you asked for. The light in the room changed, just slightly. The golden hush of late morning beginning to stretch toward noon. Thomas stood and walked to the shelf near the door, where small baskets held leftover scraps, ends of threads, mismatched swatches, faded ribbon. He picked up a piece of old blue wool. I remember this, he said. You used it for Elspeth's wedding dress. Adelaine smiled wistfully. She was beautiful in it. She wore it like joy. She still keeps it, Thomas said, though it doesn't fit anymore. Joy rarely does, the weaver replied. It comes in sizes too large for the moment, and too small for memory. Thomas returned the scrap to the basket and reached for his lantern. I'll come again before the feast, he said. You always do. He paused at the door. You've taught me something today. Adelaine waved her shuttle in mock dismissal. I'm old. That's what we're for. Outside, the sun had grown stronger, the air a little warmer. He turned back once, and she was already weaving again, lost in the rhythm, in the story her fingers knew better than words. He walked on, and for a long time, he thought only of threads, how they crossed, how they held, how they could tear, and yet how beautifully they bound things together, a place where silence speaks. The path to the river was narrow, worn not by carts or horses, but by footsteps, gentle human footsteps, the kind that returned often and never in a hurry. Thomas walked it as he always did, one hand grazing the tall grass, the other steadying his lantern even though the sun was high now and no light was needed. He passed the elder trees first, their blossoms already fading. Then came the reeds, whispering among themselves like old gossips. And finally, the willow. She stood alone on the riverbank, bent with grace rather than burden, her long green limbs trailing into the water like fingers brushing a mirror. Thomas always thought of the willow as a she. There was something feminine in her patience, her way of watching the world, not with eyes, but with presence. He greeted her with a small nod, as if she might nod back. Then he sat on the bench beneath her branches, carved long ago by a man whose name no one remembered, but whose hands had left gentle curves in the wood. The river moved slowly here. It did not rush. It didn't need to. It knew where it was going, and that was enough. Thomas placed the lantern beside him, though it was unnecessary. Habit. Ritual. Some part of him believed that even when you didn't need the light, it was good to carry it. He closed his eyes. The breeze carried the scent of wet stone, wild mint, and something sweeter. Perhaps a memory itself. When he opened them again, the river seemed brighter, as though his thoughts had cleared the glass of the world. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a length of ribbon, faded rose red, its edges frayed with time. He laid it gently across his knees. His wife had worn this in her hair the day they met. She had been sitting right here, beneath this same willow, tying the ribbon into a braid while humming a song he never found the name of. She had looked up at him and smiled, like she already knew the story they would share. He remembered how the river shimmered behind her, how the light had caught in her eyes, how he had fumbled his words and made her laugh. And now, all that shimmered was the ribbon. Thomas didn't cry. He rarely did. Grief, after a time, becomes too familiar for tears. It sits beside you like an old friend, no longer sharp, no longer loud, just there. Always. He held the ribbon for a while, letting the willow's shadow fall across it. Then he folded it again and placed it carefully back into the cloth. Not out of sadness, but reverence. A bird landed on one of the willow's branches above him, a kingfisher with feathers like jewel-toned fire. It tilted its head at Thomas, curious, then darted down to the water, catching a glimmer of silver before vanishing downstream. He watched it go. "Not everything stays," he murmured. But some things did, like the way the willow bent but never broke, like the river that always returned in time, even if it wandered. He leaned back and let his eyes close again. The warmth of the sun filtered through the leaves, painting soft patterns on his face. In the distance, he could hear faint sounds from the village. Hammer on wood, the call of a mother, the bellows of the blacksmith's forge. Life continued, as it should. But here, at the river's edge, time softened. Words loosened, and memory became something you could breathe in like mist. He stayed until the sun had shifted, and the light on the water turned from gold to silver. Then, quietly, he rose. He touched the trunk of the willow before leaving, his palm resting on the rough bark like a goodbye. One he had made many times before and would make again. The ribbon stayed with him, folded and safe. So did the moment. So did she, of worn souls and quiet wisdom. The shoemaker's shop was tucked between two cottages on the quieter side of the village, closer to the hedgerows than the marketplace, and partly hidden beneath a climbing rose bush that hadn't been trimmed in years. Thomas always found comfort in how unchanged it was. The sign above the door, A wooden boot, painted in faded green, creaked in the breeze, as if nodding a greeting to those who passed below. He stepped inside without knocking. The door's bell gave a polite chime, announcing him like an old friend. The smell inside was as it had always been: leather, dust, oiled wood, and faintly cinnamon. The shoemaker kept a stick of cinnamon tucked behind the chimney brick. To keep the cold from getting in, he always said, though Thomas suspected it was just because it made him smile. "Thomas," came a warm voice from the back. "You're late." "I'm not," Thomas replied. "You're early." The shoemaker laughed, a deep rolling sound that made the windows tremble. He emerged from behind a curtain of hanging boots, wiping his hands on a cloth. His name was Bram. Broad in the shoulders, with hair the color of cobwebs and skin like worn parchment, he had been making shoes in Eldergrove for nearly 60 years. "Tea's still warm," Bram said, gesturing toward the kettle. "Just poured a second cup in case a wise man wandered in." "I'll take it," Thomas said, settling into the low chair near the fire. The two men sat in easy silence for a few minutes, sipping their tea. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a breeze shook the rose bush, scattering petals across the windowsill like little notes from the season. Bram spoke first. "I finished a pair for Edith's grandson yesterday. Big feet. Never trust a child with big feet. They leave faster." Thomas chuckled. "Perhaps they just have farther to go." "Still," Bram said, "there's something about children's shoes. They come back to you years later, worn, dusty, forgotten in a trunk. And suddenly, all that childhood returns with them. Scuffed toes and all." He leaned down and pulled a box from beneath the bench. Inside were several pairs of tiny shoes, some soft, some stiff, some barely held together. "Every pair a story," he said. Thomas picked up a small pair of red leather shoes, the stitching frayed. "Were these?" "Mine," Bram said, grinning. "First ones I ever made, for my sister's daughter. She outgrew them in 3 months but refused to let them go." Thomas turned them gently in his hands. "They're imperfect," he said kindly. "They're honest," Bram corrected. "The best shoes are like the best lives. Imperfect, worn, and loved through it all." Thomas put the shoes back, and they sat again in silence. After a while, Bram reached into his coat and pulled out a small, battered book. "Here," he said. "Take a look." It was a ledger, one of the oldest Thomas had seen. Inside, instead of money or orders, were notes, personal ones, scribbled in careful, messy ink. June 14th. Made boots for the widow Lennet. She cried when she touched the leather. August 2nd. Sandals for the beggar boy. Gave them for free. He ran through the square shouting he was a prince. October 9th. Repaired Thomas's left boot again. Told him it wouldn't last. It did. Thomas laughed. "You keep stories," he said. "I don't mend soles," Bram replied. "I remember them." The fire popped. The tea cooled. The shadows shifted gently on the walls. "Tell me something," Bram said, voice quieter now. "If you could walk one road again, just once, where would it lead?" Thomas looked down at his boots. Old, polished by time, soles worn smooth. "I'd walk the one behind my home," he said. "At dusk, just before the lamps are lit, with someone's hand in mine." Bram nodded. A good road, a quiet one. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Maybe that's what we all want in the end. Not to find new places, but to return to the ones we loved. Just one more time. They didn't say much after that. The kettle was emptied. The fire faded to amber. When Thomas finally stood to leave, Bram handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "A patch for your boot," he said. "Even the best soles need mending sometimes." Thomas accepted it with a smile. "Thank you, friend." As he stepped out into the afternoon sun, the door creaked behind him, and the bell chimed once more. A farewell, or perhaps a blessing. And the steps he took, though slow, felt lighter somehow. The light we carry and what it remembers. Thomas never went anywhere without his lantern. To the chapel, to the river. Even on bright days with the sky as clear as spring water, it swung gently at his side, silent, unlit, but always present. People noticed, of course. They asked. He always smiled and gave a different answer each time. "It's for lost keys," he'd say. Or, "I find thoughts better in its light." Or sometimes just, "Old habits are hard to put down." But none of these were the truth. Not really. That morning, as he stepped through the garden gate behind his cottage, toward the grove of elms where the fog still lingered, he paused by the stone bench that faced east. The lantern flickered slightly, though it hadn't been lit. And then he sat. For the first time in a long while, he opened it. Inside wasn't a candle. Not anymore. What lay within was a folded scrap of paper, yellowed with age, curled at the corners and tied with a thread so fine it could barely be seen. He undid the knot, unfolded it, read it again. He didn't need to, of course. He had it memorized. But reading it was like hearing her voice again. "My Thomas, if you ever feel lost, carry this light. Not to find the road, but to remind yourself you're still walking. I'll meet you at the end. Always. E." Her name had been Eleanor. They had shared 34 springs together. She had written the note in the final days, when her hands were weak and her breath came like whispers. He had promised to carry it, not just the paper, but the meaning. So he placed it in the lantern, and carried it ever since. The villagers never asked much after the first few years. They accepted the lantern like they accepted the bell tower's toll at dawn, or the way the hills turned gold in late summer. But Thomas never stopped feeling its weight. Not in his hand, but in his heart. It wasn't heavy with sadness. It was full of her, of them, of all they had walked through, hand in hand. He sat in the garden for a long time that morning. The elms swayed above him. Birdsong filtered in through the branches, delicate as lace. And he remembered. The first time he met her, barefoot in the chapel green, laughing as she danced with the children. The way she brewed her tea too strong. The way she hummed when she sewed, always just a little off-key. And the way, even in silence, she always made him feel heard. He returned the note to the lantern, closed it gently, and though the morning was already bright, he lit the lantern anyway, just for a moment. A small flame bloomed within, warm and golden. It wasn't much, but in that quiet moment it felt like sunlight made small, a little sun he could carry. He watched it flicker and then die. And yet it stayed with him. That was the secret of the lantern. It didn't just hold a flame, it held a promise. When Thomas stood to leave, he carried the lantern differently. Not just by the handle, but with both hands as one might carry a memory too precious to set down. As he stepped back onto the road, the fog had cleared. The morning had opened like a door, and ahead of him the world waited. Quiet, wide, and filled with light, where memory rings louder than time. The elm grove behind Thomas's cottage was always cool in the afternoon. The trees, tall and old, filtered the sunlight into soft green waves that danced on the forest floor like fallen dreams. Birds sang quietly here, not to perform, but as if reminding the world that it was still breathing. Thomas had come only to rest. He leaned against the broadest trunk, lantern at his side, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, he told himself, but just to listen. But sleep came anyway, softly, like a tide rising over stone. In his dream, he stood before a tower. Not his own. This one was taller, older, and made of a kind of pale stone that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Vines curled up its sides like fingers trying to remember a shape. There was a bell at the top, massive, motionless, and beside it stood a boy, thin, barefoot, wearing clothes too big and too worn. Thomas knew, without being told, that the boy was him. "You're late," the boy said, not turning around. Thomas approached quietly. "Late for what?" "For the ringing," said the boy. "I don't remember this place." "You never forgot it either." The boy turned then, and his face, Thomas's face, only younger, was serious in the way that only children can be. The kind of serious that holds wonder just beneath its skin. "What bell is this?" Thomas asked. The boy pointed upward, and now the bell began to move. Slowly, with the weight of centuries. Not swinging, not chiming, but humming. A low, deep sound, like the earth remembering its first heartbeat. And with the hum came visions. Not sharp, not fast, but flowing, like light through stained glass. He saw his mother's hands hanging herbs in the window. He saw the chapel's first snowfall. He saw Bram laughing beside the fire. He saw Eleanor brushing his collar and pretending not to cry before he left for the harvest war. He saw a child he never had, waving from a path that never existed. And the sound of the bell continued, calling not toward action, but toward knowing. "I never climbed this tower," Thomas whispered. The boy smiled. "You never had to." Thomas looked around. The stone beneath his feet was warm now, pulsing with quiet life. "What is this place?" The boy knelt and placed a small object on the floor between them, a candle, unlit. "You tell me." Thomas knelt too, reached into his cloak. The lantern was there, even in the dream. He opened it. The flame inside flickered as if surprised to see another. Then, without needing to be told, it leaned toward the candle. A kiss of light passed between them. The candle lit. The bell rang once, clear, gentle, like a voice you love saying your name in the dark. When Thomas woke, the grove was silent. Sunlight had shifted. The birds were gone, or quiet. And yet something lingered. A faint humming in the bones, a softness in the air. He looked at the lantern. It was warm. He smiled and whispered, "Thank you." That night, he would tell no one of the dream. But he would carry it, not as a mystery to solve, but as a song he once heard and might hear again if he listened closely enough. What waits in silence speaks in time. It was on a gray morning that Thomas returned to the chapel. Rain had come and gone in the night, leaving behind the scent of wet stone and wood smoke. The air held that soft stillness that follows after a storm, when even the birds wait before singing again. Thomas had no reason to be there, not exactly. Just a feeling, a sort of tug in the chest, the kind that doesn't ask for explanation, only movement. He followed it like a thread. The chapel was empty, as it usually was on Thursdays. The candles had long since burned out. The altar cloth had faded to a gentle ivory. Even the pews seemed to exhale in his presence, as if they'd been waiting quietly and were glad to be noticed. Thomas didn't pray, not with words. He walked slowly, touching the edges of stone and wood, as if reading the room with his hands. Then, behind the altar, Near a crooked beam where the plaster had cracked long ago, he noticed something odd. A sliver of parchment, pressed between two stones. He hesitated, not from fear, but from reverence. Then, carefully, he worked the paper loose. It was old, fragile, curled like a leaf left too long in the sun. But the ink remained, thin, faded but legible. A letter, no name, no address, just a voice caught in time. He sat on the altar step and read. If someone finds this, then time is softer than I feared. I do not know what year you live in, nor if the chapel still stands, but I write because I need to speak, not to be heard, just to say the words aloud, even if only stone listens. Thomas paused. The rain outside had begun again, soft as breath. He read on. I am a bellkeeper's daughter. My name is Marian, and I am tired, not of living, but of silence. I love someone who cannot return my love, and I do not curse him for it. But my heart, unused to restraint, does not know where to place its song. So I give it to the stones. If you find this, whoever you are, please remember something for me. Love, even unanswered, is still a gift. It teaches us how deep we can go without drowning, how bright we can burn, even in the absence of return. Thomas folded the letter carefully. He sat for a while, the chapel around him listening as it always had. He thought of Marian, of her sorrow, but also of her strength, to write, to hope, to leave something behind, not as a plea, but as a poem. He didn't know how long ago she'd lived, perhaps a decade, perhaps a century, but her voice felt close, like a breath on the nape of the soul. He slipped the letter back into the wall, tucking it deeper, wrapping it gently in a scrap of cloth from his pocket. And beside it, he placed something else, a note of his own. Marian, I heard you, and though we've never met, I carry your words now. You are not forgotten. The stones kept your secret. Now I'll carry your song. Tea. The chapel, quiet as ever, seemed to hum, the same way dreams do when they brush against the waking world. Thomas smiled, and for the first time in years, he hummed aloud as he walked home. A low, gentle tune, not his own, but one passed down, stone to breath, letter to heart. Some lights are meant to be shared. The storm arrived with no warning, not the kind that creeps in on heavy clouds and restless winds, but the kind that crashes like a shout in a silent room. One moment, the village sky was still and pale. The next, thunder. Thomas had seen storms before, lived through many, but this one felt different. Not darker, just closer, like something was listening. Rain slammed against the shutters of his cottage, and wind howled like it was looking for a name. Outside, the trees bent low, and the chapel bell rang once, though no one had pulled the rope. Inside, Thomas sat in his chair by the window, the lantern glowing beside him. Its flame flickered, but never faltered. He watched as the lights across the village began to go out, one by one. He could have stayed indoors, safe, warm. But as he looked out into the night and saw darkness swallowing the paths, he felt the familiar pull again. Not fear, but duty. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't shout or announce itself, just rises like breath. He stood, took the lantern from the windowsill, wrapped his cloak around his shoulders, and stepped into the storm. Rain hit him sideways. His boots sank into mud. The wind pushed against him with every step, but he kept walking. The lantern swung gently, its light golden and steady, cutting a small path through the rain. House after house was dark. No candles in the windows, no firelight at the hearth. Just silence. and the hush of frightened hearts waiting for the world to calm. He came first to old Mrs. Weatherby's cottage. Her shutters had broken free in the wind, clapping like hands that had forgotten what they were applauding. Thomas knocked gently. The door creaked open. She stood there, wrapped in 2 shawls, eyes wide. "Power's gone," she said, as if that explained everything. "I know," he replied, lifting the lantern, "but light hasn't." He stepped inside, lit a small candle on her mantel with the lantern's flame. "Just a bit," he said, "enough to make the room less lonely." She nodded, smiled. "Thank you, dear." He nodded back, then turned. There were others still in the dark. He went door to door, each time offering only a little. A flame to light 1 candle, a smile, a few words. He said very little, but the lantern said enough. Its light filled the space it entered, not just in glow, but in spirit, in comfort, in memory. At one house, a child cried in the corner until she saw the lantern's light bouncing against the walls. "It's like the sun came back," she whispered. At another, a man who'd fought in wars sat silently, watching the flame, then said, "Haven't seen that kind of gold since the morning my boy was born." Thomas nodded, letting them speak, letting the light listen. It took hours. By the time he reached the chapel, the storm had begun to ease. Not gone, but softer, like a tantrum finishing its last sob. Thomas stepped inside, soaked and shivering, placed the lantern on the altar, and sat. He didn't speak, just watched the flame dance in the center of the room. It had burned through the worst of the wind, carried from house to house, kindled a dozen other lights. But still it burned. Still it held. That was the thing about some flames. They were made for more than just warmth. They were made for sharing. And in that quiet moment, after the worst had passed, Thomas felt something new. Not pride, not relief, but peace. The kind that comes not from what you've done, but from knowing why you did it. The storm had knocked out the lights, but not the light. And as long as he could walk, as long as he could carry this lantern, Thomas knew he would never let the village be without it. When the bell speaks, hearts listen. The morning was still, so still that even the leaves seemed to wait. The village woke gently, without urgency, wrapped in a mist that softened every corner and edge. Windows creaked open, kettles murmured, doors eased ajar, but no one hurried. It was the first Sunday of spring, and for reasons no one could quite explain, everyone felt the same thing in the air, a pause, as if the world was taking a breath. Thomas rose early, as he always did. He warmed water, lit the fire, wrapped his scarf twice, not once. But something in his motions was slower, not from pain, just patience. He looked around the cottage, every shelf and stone as familiar as breath, and let his eyes linger on things he usually passed without thought. The mark on the windowsill where the lantern once scorched the wood. The chip in the bowl he'd kept since youth. The worn spot on the floor where he'd always stood to read. He smiled and put on his boots. The chapel was cold when he arrived, but it always was before the sun reached its bones. He lit the lantern as he entered, even though the daylight had already begun to warm the stained glass. He didn't speak. He rarely did these days. The stones knew him well enough not to need words. He climbed the tower slowly. Each step felt measured. Not heavy, not hard, just exact. At the top, the bell waited. She'd waited through every season, every sermon, every silence. Thomas reached out and touched the rope. Not yet pulling, just remembering. There was no one gathered in the chapel below. No ceremony, no audience, just Thomas. And the bell. and the morning. He closed his eyes and rang the bell. Once, just once, a single note, low, deep, clear. It rose through the chapel, through the clouds, through the hearts of every villager still cradling tea or brushing hair or waiting for bread to rise. They stopped, not in fear, not even in surprise, but in understanding. Something had shifted, and not one of them could say how they knew, only that the bell had never sounded quite like that before, and never would again. Thomas stood with the rope still in his hand, listening, not for an echo, but for the quiet that came after. It was full, alive, complete. He descended the tower slower than he had gone up. When he reached the chapel floor, he sat, not from weariness, but from fullness. He placed the lantern beside him. Its light flickered gently, as if nodding toward the silence that now filled the space. And there, in that stillness, Thomas rested, eyes open, heart calm. The morning sun rose through the stained glass, casting colors across the old stone floor. A breeze moved through the chapel, lifting dust and dreams alike. He did not speak again, but he didn't need to. That evening, when a few villagers came looking for him, they found him still sitting, peaceful as ever. The bell rope hung straight. The lantern was warm, and outside the mist had finally lifted. They did not weep. They did not wail. They sat with him, lit a candle, and listened to the silence together. In the weeks that followed, the bell was rung again, not often, but always gently, always with care. And those who rang it, young or old, said the same thing. It's like he's still here. And maybe he was, in the hush, in the echo, in the soft light of the lantern that never went out. Because some lives don't end. They simply ring once and never stop.